Thank you so much for coming out. So this is my first semester here at Texas A&M. We came from San Diego. It's really cold here in Texas. I didn't realize, like, it's San Diego, it was 75, and then it got down to like 72 during the winter. That was not the case when we woke up this morning, when it was like 32, 33. So definitely a surprise coming to Texas. Or returning. My first duty assignment was in El Paso, Texas. So it's good to be back. So quick story. My wife and I, Susan, who's here, the second day we were in College Station, we went to the bank. We had to open up a bank account, and we're just dying. Like we're dragging from the parking lot to the, just sweating. And we get there, and this woman who's got a just beautiful Texas drawl, she's like, "Well, how do you like the weather, honey?" And we're like, "Oh my God, it's so hot." And she's like, "Hot? Oh no, this is cool right now." And we're like, "Oh my God, it's so humid." She's like, "No, you came here in a good week." And I'm like, "Oh." And it got worse from there. We made the mistake though, moving in like late July. So that was our fault. So that's right. Oh yeah, that's right. So, well, again, thank you so much for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. And a part of me thinks that this is an unfortunate reality, that this is as timely as it is. And I wish it wasn't, but it is. So I'd like to start tonight with a question. What is your personal relationship with war? Have you served? And if so, what did that service mean to you? Did it leave you with a sense of pride? Or are you still carrying with you a sense of disappointment or even guilt or scars, emotional or physical? If we raise that question one level up, what has been your family's relationship with war? Have your parents served, or your aunts and your uncles? And what has that service meant to your family? Has it given them a sense of pride, a coherence with the nation? Has it made them feel more patriotic, or in other cases, made them feel a little distraught by their experiences? Well, what if we raise that question one level higher and ask, what has our nation's relationship with war been like for the past 80 or so years? And that's the question I'd like to wrestle with this evening. What has our relationship as Americans been like since the end of World War II? And I think the best place to start is in 1945. World War II is over. And if you ask one general who was most responsible for the victory of that war, Douglas MacArthur would tell you it was Douglas MacArthur. Who else besides Douglas MacArthur deserved the lion's share of credit for the ultimate victory that he helped attain? When you read his memoirs, Reminiscences, you hear this self-congratulatory MacArthur recalling he leading his army, leaping across the Pacific from one success to another, helping the Japanese armed forces write the last chapters in their epic story of defeat. His flair for the dramatic was in full force in his memoirs. But it didn't end with World War II. As proconsul to help rebuild and reform a defeated Japan, the general extolled an unbending faith in American power, and not just military power. MacArthur hailed the supposed transformative capabilities and capacities of the United States to reconstitute a new Asia, as he said, to usher in a revolution which would restore the dignity and the freedom of the common man in Japan. Wow. But he wasn't alone in that faith. In 1947, while MacArthur is still proconsul in Japan, the head of the ACLU heads over there at the invitation of MacArthur. And he comes back after a 3-month trip, and he's effusive in praising the development of democracy in a post-surrender Japan. He returns home from his trip, and he lauds how Japan was acting like a liberated country. Democracy, it seems, could be hand-delivered by a benevolent general and his army to a clearly grateful people. Now, this faith in American military power, it stood in stark contrast to the fear that Americans felt toward the Japanese, not just during the war, but after as well. In fact, intense fears penetrated into the very fabric of our domestic society. Under the War Relocation Act signed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack, some 122,000 Japanese Americans living on the West Coast were forced into internment camps, incarcerated, and forcibly relocated into makeshift detention centers from Arizona to Arkansas. Fears of internal subversion based on little more than racial prejudices ran deep. The California Attorney General deemed the Japanese an unassimilable people, while the Arkansas governor protested the resettlement of enemies of my country in my state. And this mass incarceration of their own citizens, not a foreign enemy, but of their own citizens, suggested something rather profound, I think, about how Americans saw themselves at the midpoint of the 20th century. Despite their victory in World War II and the confidence that it inspired, and it did, fears about America's place in the world persisted. Famed journalist Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck, suspected that Americans were filled with a sense of uncertainty and fear, with the realization, in Murrow's words, that the future is obscure and that survival is not assured. This in the aftermath of World War II, why was one of the most famous journalists in America suggesting that our survival was not assured. By 1957, MacArthur himself was decrying how our government has kept us in a perpetual state of fear, kept us in a continuous stampede of patriotic fervor with the cry of a grave national emergency. Now, MacArthur left aside that he was actually a part of perpetuating those fears, but never mind that. And I think the reason why I wanted to start with MacArthur, because his rhetoric was important. And it intimated, to me at least, two important but oftentimes overlooked themes that have been shaping Americans' paradoxical relationship with war ever since the end of World War II. A faith in, yet a fear of war. In short, what I'd like to argue this evening is that Americans have created a rather disjointed relationship with war. We're exhilarated by the possibilities to transform the world and make us and everyone else safe, while also fearing what war would do to us and our society. And this tension between faith and fear haunted Americans, and I would argue led to a persistent failure to align ends and means in carrying out U.S. foreign relations. Now, of course, ideals and interests matter. They have since our republic began. And faith in the American experiment came easy, especially to those who believed that they were part of an exceptional, chosen nation. But the more I looked at this, the more I saw that as Americans came out of the Second World War, many Americans felt that if the United States lost this new Cold War, the nation might not survive. Murrow wasn't just talking about himself, he was sharing the fears of his fellow Americans. It was a tense time. World War II, we might argue, gave Americans the world, and the faith needed to rule it. But seemingly great evils, godless evils, emerged that gave pause to policymakers and the general public alike. And here were the inklings of this relationship between faith and fear that I think have informed U.S. foreign policy ever since. Americans might have faith in their ideological exceptionalism being protected by war, yet feared that any threat, ideological or otherwise, could undermine the United States' global position. Military force then became an integral component of how Americans related with the outside world. After World War II, war occupied a place that it never really relinquished in our society. Cold warriors thus could embrace at one time a faith that American expansion naturally improved the world, while also fearing that that same world was an incredibly dangerous place. And not surprisingly then, policymakers from Harry S. Truman to Lyndon Johnson, from Henry Kissinger to Madeleine Albright, all would attempt to balance this faith and fear as they considered the relationship of war to both US domestic and foreign policies. Now, of course, just like ideals, power matters. Cold War commentators insisted over and over again that international politics was a struggle for power. This in the words of political scientist Hans Morgenthau. Yet there were some critics, some who argued and worried about the consequences of using raw power, as one called it, to achieve global dominance while overestimating threats. That wielding power might actually produce foreign policy crises rather than solve them. And so in many ways, America's relationship with war, it became a bit dysfunctional. A secular faith in war to solve any foreign policy problem, coupled with fears of America's enemies bringing destruction to the nation's shores, I think they indelibly shaped policy choices when it came to everything from helping to conduct nation-building exercises overseas to containing communist bogeymen around the world. Americans largely held faith that war would be utilitarian, a rational means for attaining their desired ends. At the same time, again, they feared what it would bring. And so if we think about this in such a cognitive framing up here, that was also, I think, an emotional framing down here. War might bring chaos, and many times it did, but it also lured with the promise of influence, even dominance, the chance to reshape or control entire swaths of our planet. Now, with this, I think, came important and enormous social and cultural consequences and implications that rippled across the decades after World War II. Now, by faith, I am not talking about religious determinants in US foreign policy. For sure, there were church leaders who used their pulpits in the service of both God and the anti-communist cause. I was reading with my students this semester an essay on religion in World War II, and Billy Graham said that if Jesus was on our anti-communist football team, that he would be the quarterback. So Jesus was definitely part of this anti-communist cause. What instead I'm expressing here is faith as an anecdote for policymakers' unwavering trust and confidence in war as a vital tool for achieving their objectives. Now, there will be times when that faith will waver, in moments where we're concerned about what war might wrought, the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the aftermath of the 1968 Tet Offensive in Vietnam, where Americans for a moment will briefly question their faith, but oftentimes only momentarily. During the Cold War, then, Americans proselytized their faith to uphold their position as the world's most powerful nation. At others, they sent soldiers out as missionaries to save humanity from itself. And I think in all this, we can spy a sense of hubris that pervaded Americans' faith in war and too often in themselves. And notably, there were some among the policymaking elite who did not blindly embrace war for all its positive impacts, whose faith could be shaken by what war had wrought. Some worried, for instance, like journalist Walter Lippmann, a famed journalist, about the creation of a militarized garrison state trampling upon our individual liberties. Yet too often, I think those voices were drowned out. The United States had to generate power, so the argument went, and then use that power to advance its political aims against an unyielding, godless enemy. Now, throughout the Cold War, this faith also helped produce cultural meaning, a way for Americans to make sense of the world around them and their place in it. Terms like national defense and national security became increasingly important. Americans grappled with their connotations. They thought about their implications and debated how their very identity was bound up in the definition of war. And yet, Americans' faith in war remained at odds with, I would argue, an objective accounting of the historical record. Faith ignored the tangible limits of American power abroad. Something we Americans are really uncomfortable talking about, aren't we? That there are possibly limits to our power overseas. Faith discounted the reality that war never seemed to deliver as much as policymakers desired of it. We might ask if anything really delivers as much as we want from it. But faith also partnered well with domestic politics. No politician is going to hope to win office by campaigning on the limits of American power, right? I'm not going to move here to Houston and say, vote for me. I believe in the limits of American power. That's not going to get me out of the primary. That's not going to get me anywhere. Instead, throughout much of the Cold War, eager candidates extolled the nation's military capabilities, diminishing the costs of war while worshiping its benefits. Rarely did they consider that military intervention might make matters worse, exacerbating local problems instead of solving them. Perhaps those who didn't accept this compulsory faith were branded as unpatriotic heretics. A false faith in war, taken to its extreme, bred not just hyper-patriotism, but xenophobia and nativism. And in the process, political dissent was driven to the periphery. It seemed far easier and far more patriotic to embrace false promises of easy, if not at least eventual victory when the nation committed itself to war, especially against an ideology antagonistic to our own, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Omar Bradley said in 1949. Now, aside that faith in war sat a fear that nearly all national security threats, both foreign and domestic, were existential ones. Americans bounded their faith in war to a kind of Hobbesian, primal fear of the unknown. And if the English philosopher was right that the human state of nature was one of endemic war, and it's hard these days to argue against that, then only a strong state could provide the security needed to dampen their fears. So what were Americans afraid of? What left them in a near constant state of Cold War paranoia? Well, everything. They feared atomic war and unconventional war. They feared an anarchic international system seemingly under threat by this godless communist forces. They feared arms races and missile gaps, threats from abroad and threats from home. They feared depressions and recessions. They feared the future and the past. They feared Soviet spies and Cuban revolutionaries. And perhaps worst of all, and in what is most relevant to today, they feared each other. Americans displayed a kind of neurotic anxiety born of perpetually exaggerated fear. Now, historical precedents surely carried weight. I have to say that because I'm a historian. So check the clock. Pearl Harbor remained on the minds of many Americans long after the ultimate victory in World War II. The surprise Japanese attack there exposed the lack of preparedness that arguably set in motion long-lasting fears. The U.S. Armed Forces would now have to project power far from their shores. Why? Because these vast oceans that used to protect us no longer served as inviolable barriers from our enemies. In many ways, never again became a sort of mantra of the Cold War era. On the 10th anniversary of the day that would live in infamy, Vice President Alben W. Barkley of Kentucky, go Cats. My wife went to University of Kentucky, so I have to say that. He offered counsel at a memorial ceremony in Honolulu with a clear and simple message. We must never again be heedless or complacent. All right, here's your trivia for this evening. Alben Barkley became Vice President of the United States in 1949, which means that the United States of America did not have a vice president between 1945, the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the inauguration of Alben Barkley. So for almost 4 years, our country did not have a vice president of the United States. Did you know that? I did not know that before I started this project. I guess I should have. This chilling sense of vulnerability of which Barkley spoke in Honolulu and the need for absolute security, which I'm not sure exists, I think helped redefine what war meant for Americans then and arguably ever since. No longer could citizen soldiers demobilize after war, setting the foundation for a permanent security, if not surveillance state, that seemed at odds with the very ideals of our founding fathers. Preparation for war would have to be now continuous, an enduring activity embedded in so many ways into Americans' daily lives. Once more, apparent existential threats justified their fears. Communist expansion, national and ethnic rivalries, and nuclear proliferation. All of these purported to destabilize an international system in which national security was far from certain. And so insecurity became ingrained into our national security state. As the Cold War endured, we might not be surprised that opportunistic politicians realized that this existential fear could be useful. Could be used as a tool for persuasion and propaganda. Taken to its politicized extreme, fear could breed a form of consensus, a form of forced consensus. When Senator Barry Goldwater argued in 1960 that his fellow Americans might become slaves if the United States lost the war, the Cold War, to the Soviet Union, he was clearly positioning himself as a stalwart defender of the nation worthy of election to the highest of offices. Imaginary fifth columnists here at home also could burnish the credentials of those wishing to be seen as tough on communism, helping to build a sense of political solidarity with our constituencies. Exploiting fears in the fight against evil could propel eager politicians into the national spotlight. Wisconsin's Senator Joseph McCarthy, perhaps the prime example. Fellow politicians might privately revile tail gunner Joe's antics, yet Republicans increasingly took McCarthy's side as more and more Americans were swayed by his anti-communist crusade. And what is so important to note here is that it wasn't just Republicans. It was Democrats as well. And of all the places where there was bipartisan support, it was here. In embracing the fears and increasing the national security state. Someone else also took note, and it was big business. Because big business could profit from fear, whether it be building bomb shelters at home or cruise missiles to be launched abroad. Companies could reap financial rewards by hawking bomb havens and nuclear submarines and strategic bombers and a fearsome arsenal of potentially earth-shattering weapons. In fact, these insidious relationships between legislators and lobbyists, which luckily don't happen anymore today, would become a hallmark of Cold War politics, as major defense firms were rewarded for the nation's increased military posture. As one journalist noted in 1960, the purposes of the military-industrial complex fit, in his words, neatly in the atmosphere of crisis, as the United States continues to be held in the grip of wartime thinking. Think about this for a moment. It is 1960, 15 years after the end of World War II. Why were Americans still in the grip of wartime thinking? It's 2 years before the Cuban Missile Crisis, 5 years before we start to send American ground combat troops to Vietnam, 15 years after the end of World War II. Why were we still so afraid? So when we brought in our evaluation of Americans' relationship with war beyond just the political realm, and I think this is important, that war is not just politics. For those of you who read Red Clausewitz, sorry, I'm disagreeing with the Prussian gods. But it is culture and it is social. We see that Americans living in the post-World War II era, the American century, as publishing magnate Henry Luce called it, for them, war became part of their identity. War undergirded a vision of national self, a vision of the United States as a protector of global peace. And war, along with the military force required to wage it, also, not surprisingly, permitted access to foreign trade and markets. And so in many ways, Luce was foreshadowing immediate post-Cold War claims of the United States being the indispensable nation in global affairs. In a way, war helped cohere American society as it seeped across social and political and economic boundaries. And so for Cold War Americans, war was immensely relevant. As George Kennan, the father of containment, saw it in 1951, just 1 year after the opening of the Korean War, many people in this country are coming to believe that war is not only unavoidable, but imminent. And folks, I would argue today that if you went into a seminar room at the Army War College or the Navy War College, we might ask how our senior officers are being taught about our relationship with China, and whether they are being taught that war with China is not only unavoidable, but imminent. Decades of reflection had hardly altered Kennan's views. Looking back more than 30 years later, now during the Reagan administration, the State Department diplomat recalled that Americans were threatened by the outside world. So much so that they seemed to think of little else but this danger. All the while, a conviction in innocence underlie our foreign policy. Perhaps unsurprisingly, why do they hate us? Again, would become a popular refrain, especially in the aftermath of 9/11, as Americans confronted a new enemy who appeared just as vicious and just as godless as the Cold War communist hordes. So these tensions between faith and fear matter, I think, because they held significant implications for how Americans thought about war in the modern era. Americans more often than not defined power largely in military terms. It then followed almost logically that US foreign policy would become increasingly militarized. And that's why I think this is so important. War became elevated to a preeminent position among the United States' other instruments of power. We might suggest, as we near a defense budget coming in at close to $1 trillion a year, whether that still holds true. In such an environment, diplomatic means too often became devalued in relation to military ones. And so, in short, America's relationship with war in the latter half of the 20th century held huge ramifications, both at home and abroad. A Cold War did not mean the absence of violence. And far too often, the United States, because of its faith and because of its fear, had a heavy hand in propagating that violence across the globe. Senator William Fulbright deplored, as he called it, this vast diversion of energy and resources from the creative pursuits of a civilized society to the conduct of a costly and interminable struggle for world power. Notably, the Arkansas Democrat would become a fierce critic of the US escalation in Vietnam. William Faulkner also lamented, in his words, the general and universal physical fear and its consequences. There are no longer problems of the spirit, the American writer argued. There is only one question: when will I be blown up? Paradoxically, the more that Americans spent on defense, the more vulnerable they felt. So in a discussion this evening about faith, it's probably best to end with a theologian. Reinhold Niebuhr stood tall among contemporary critics, arguing that an inability to grapple with the limits of their power had left Americans anxious for the future. The ethicist maintained that it wasn't easy, in his words, for an adolescent nation with the illusion of childlike innocence to come to terms with the responsibilities and the hazards of global politics in an atomic age. As a result, powerful nations, Niebuhr said, like the United States, tended to use the weak as instruments for their own purposes. And what Niebuhr was suggesting in the early 1950s, I think still holds true today. Fear that the United States might not sustain itself as a global power, coupled with a faith in that power itself. That tension has left Americans dependent on war and all that it promises. So why does this matter? Because I think war remains a part of who we are, even as many citizens in our country today feel somewhat removed from it. And ultimately, these interactions between faith and fear have the potential to lead into a spiral, undergirding a continuing militarization of American foreign policy that I don't think is healthy. We believe, at least we want to believe, that war and military power can solve all of our problems, but are fearful, acutely so, that any weakness will lead to the direct end of our republic. But faith in war and raw military power, they need not govern our foreign policy. And fear of war need not consign us to a future of existential insecurities. And so, as we all look to the future, we might consider having a little less faith and a little less fear and a lot more wisdom when it comes to war. Thank you.
So, thank you, Greg. And for any of you who come to our events, you know we host a lot of excellent speakers, great authors. This is one of the most thought-provoking books I've read in a long time. I think it's important for the United States and as us as American citizens to think about a lot of what you're putting forward. And just for any of you to know, you are balanced. You fairly point out that some of these irrational fears were held by the Soviets, held by Mao and others, Chinese, communist regimes. You're not just, taking on Americans for the sake of taking on Americans. I'm going to turn to the audience questions in a moment, but obviously the book you begin 1945. It's okay, because I'll grab those. You begin 1945, World War II. I think most people agree the most seminal, important event in modern world history, still shaping us today. The faith and fear that comes out of it. Was it different, do you think, in the United States than maybe what it was in the Soviet Union, was in China? Obviously, they are not democracies. Yeah. The impact and what the people may want or fear is different in the Soviet Union under Stalin, especially initially, or under Mao. But is there also something different that maybe and not at all to take away from the Greatest Generation? They are incredible. But for relatively similar populations, the United States lost about 450,000 Americans during World War II. 99.5% were military losses. Right. You look at China, it's 20 to 30 million died. The Soviet Union, roughly 27, 28 million, of which 20 million are civilians. Was perhaps our kind of less dire and catastrophic experience with war part of what shaped the American public's belief that while we might fear war, if we go to war, it's not going to be as bad as what others might think of? Yeah,
that's a great question. I don't think that this is unique to our country. I certainly think that, when you look at the Soviet Union as just one example, throughout much of the Cold War, there was a faith in the communist system ultimately prevailing in this Cold War. That if we think about the Cold War as a competition between ideologies, from Stalin through Khrushchev through Brezhnev, there is a longstanding faith, even through Gorbachev in many ways, a longstanding faith that the communist system would prevail. There were inherent weaknesses within a democratic capitalist system. Now, clearly, we saw that was just the opposite, right? That there were inherent weaknesses in the communist system. So I don't think that this relationship between faith and fear is unique to the United States. I think what happened for Americans in particular was that there was a whole host of issues happening at the same time that exacerbated these tensions. And I think the breaking point in many ways was 1945 with the atomic bomb. There's a great historian, Paul Boyer, who wrote a wonderful book back in the late 1980s called By Bombs Early Light. It's kind of a social and cultural history of these immediate moments after the Cold War. After the dropping of the atomic bomb. And Boyer argues that what we see is literally a break in time, that there was the past and now we're in the future. There's no present, that the dropping of the atomic bombs literally broke time. And I think with that then was this incredible sense of fear on top of, for Americans in particular, an incredible sense of responsibility. And when those two things came together, where I think Americans who genuinely believed in the righteousness of American power, who believed, based on their experiences in World War II, that they had saved the world from totalitarianism and militarism and fascism and all the bad isms, that when a new ism arose, communism, or re-arose, we might say, that this special responsibility now, I think, pushed that tension between faith and fear to the forefront of American policy. And what exacerbated that then was a series of events that came very quickly, one after the other. The Soviet Union testing the atomic bomb far more quickly than we thought they would. The Chinese communists winning the Chinese Civil War. The successful, the invasion of South Korea by North Korea. All of these events happening one right after the other suggested that the world was perhaps even more dangerous than it was in the 1930s and 1940s. And given the power that we had gained during World War II, and with that power, because I like Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. Thank you, Uncle Ben. That moment in time, I think, was what cemented this relationship more uniquely for us than I think in more totalitarian regimes like China and the Soviet Union.
Okay. And again, some of these questions, people put their name, some people don't. And that's totally fine either way. And this one, I'm not sure if I'm reading the name, if it's Ron or Russ, so I'm sorry if I got it wrong. But someone asked, how does a nation, state, country, region protect its social construct? I guess, so is that balance between a government and nation's responsibility to protect its people and its promise that people keep them safe and have a reasonable government? But how do you kind of walk that line between, I suppose, going too far to irrational kind of fears and expeditions, all around the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. Who asked that? And nobody want to take credit for that. Thank you, sir. It's a great question. So what is the first responsibility of government? It's the protection of its people, right? And I think that's why I mentioned that power is important. And I think we would all be naive to suggest that power is not a part of international relations. It clearly is. I think it's Will Rogers who said diplomacy is talking until you can find a stick to beat off the dog or something along those lines. Clearly, Will Rogers is far more eloquent than I am. But what I found in my research for this book was that what was fascinating and somewhat ironic is that as Americans placed their faith in war, they somehow lost a faith in their own identity and system. We lost a faith in who we were. Why was it that if communism was such an awful ideology that was doomed to fall in on itself, why were we so scared of it? Did we really, really believe during the Red Scare that Americans were going to become communists? Why did we not have more faith that the American nation and how we all collectively were brought up in one way or another, that communism just didn't fit for American history and norms and values? And I'm clearly way generalizing here. But what I found with the Red Scare in particular is that as we placed more and more faith and power to satiate our fears, we lost a faith in ourselves. And I think, to me, that's where history, I think, offers important perspectives. We are best when we believe in some of the values that we purport are important for us, to have faith in those values, to have faith in those ideals. And it's the moments where we lose that faith that we react in a way that becomes militaristic. And I think we lose the balance between kind of protecting the physical society and how we define what national security meant, both during World War II and after, and securing our values by living up to them and having faith in them.
And if you're wondering, I think for the camera, Maria asked me to sit down. A good question is something you address throughout the book, because it is obviously beyond just democracy promotion and liberal ideals. There's the corollary of that of spreading capitalism and open markets. TD asked, do you think the American economy would have been in this position without all of these wars? And I suppose, in essence, would the American economy be as big and as strong as global and vibrant if we had not gone through this period?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
I don't think that that, I mean, certainly there are moments in time where access to markets is important. No better place to look than obviously the Persian Gulf, and why Americans were initially fearful of Soviet forces remaining in Iran in 1946, where Joseph Stalin had kind of said, well, maybe we'll keep forces here in the Middle East. And that clearly, as World War II demonstrated the value of petroleum to our military effort, decided that access to the Middle East and in particular the Persian Gulf were important. But I don't necessarily see and historians are really bad at counterfactuals. But I don't see that it was necessary for us to maintain economic access, especially with our allies, by having to resort to war.
And just kind of a bit of a follow up to that. Always thank you, students from the Audi International School. Great to have you guys here. A bit of follow up to that. Olivia asked from Audi, to what extent did idealistic utilitarian motives play a larger role in determining America's relationship with war, as opposed to economic and perhaps neocolonialist motives? You know.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Really smart question. And I ask my students this all the time. What was most important in the immediate aftermath of World War II? Was it entering into the atomic era, or was it the decolonization effort that quickly unfolded across the globe? And in many ways, the two things come together in a way that create fears that just do this, right? That we're so worried about these decolonizing nations moving into the Soviet orbit, into the communist orbit, that we then become very interventionist into the global South in a way that has, I think, far greater implications than entering in the atomic era. That if nuclear deterrence was successful, thank God so far it has been, that the tangible implications of World War II then become what happens, what inspires American policy, and decolonization, I think, inspires a very interventionist approach to the global South. And then I think when you add on top of that a way to caricaturize your enemy in the global South, whether it's Mao or Stalin or Khrushchev, as totalitarian enemies who are simply going to gobble up these pieces of the world and use local peoples as pawns for the communist attempts at global domination. And one of the phrases you hear over and over and over again in documents is communists being intent on global or world domination. And so my strong sense is that when you look about the fears that decolonization are inspiring, and then adding on top of that a way to characterize these totalitarian states as being enemies of the people because they're vulnerable to communist ideologies, that becomes, I think, a recipe for interventionism into the global South that we see in Southeast Asia, East Asia, throughout much of Latin America, in part because those two things come together. That's a good question. Thank you.
Another great student question from Sophia, also for the Audi School. Do you find a U.S. foreign policy of the Cold War react to the U.S. claim of being democratic and also promoting the liberal world order? I suppose in some ways, if you could address sometimes what was kind of the inherent contradiction of modernizing a nation, but doing it sometimes at the end of a barrel of a gun.
Yeah. You two want to come up here and just take over? Like, these are really good questions. Where do you guys go to school? Nice. All right. Well, tell your teachers, well done. Are you here? Oh, okay. Well done. You well done, not you well done. Okay. So here's what I tell my students. And just look at the newspaper today, right? Or any newspaper today. Democracy is messy. Democracy is unstable in many ways. And the one thing that Cold War American policymakers are most worried about is stability. And so when you see revolutionary movements, especially in the Western Hemisphere, as just one example, who are looking at this moment of decolonization as an opportunity now to break the bonds, break away from the bonds of autocracy and dictatorial regimes, and institute social and economic reform. That's messy. And then it also then immediately becomes equated with social and economic reform. Sounds like communism. And that becomes even messier and more fear-inducing. And so what oftentimes you will see in Latin America or the Middle East is US policymakers preferencing stability and thus align themselves with autocratic regimes rather than align themselves with the revolutionaries, because that was more messier. That was more, again, fear-inducing, because it potentially did two things. If the locals weren't smart enough to choose the right path and chose and threw their lot in with the communists, then pieces of the global South, large swaths potentially, would be closed off to American markets. So that was one fear. And then I think the second one was akin to that, where we saw the Cold War as a zero-sum game. That any time that the Soviets won in the global South, that the Americans somehow lost, and that would have then an impact on credibility and prestige. And anytime the Soviets won, that would diminish American credibility and prestige, which then over time would weaken us as a global power. And I think when those two things came together, it created a lot of fear that then, oddly enough, pushed us into the global South, because we then had an odd faith in our ability to use military power in conjunction with economic power and social reform to conduct nation building exercises. And so if you haven't gotten into it yet, there's this theory in the 1950s called modernization theory, which argues, if you guys talked about modernization theory, and you guys are on it, which argued, right, that we could shepherd these traditional societies, as Walt Rostow argued, into the modern age. And all they had to do was follow these kind of blocks along a very steady upward line till they got to the end point. And who was the example at the end point? It was us. And so what happened was that because of these fears of decolonization, these fears of messy social reforms, democratic reforms, democracies trying to bubble up across the global South, we put our faith in attaching military power to social and economic development in a way that then pushed us into nation building exercises, into what we would call in Vietnam counterinsurgency exercises, that then kind of ramped up violence in the global South in a way that in many instances undermined our position. Because as I mentioned during the talk, what we found looking back is many times when Americans intervened, they were exacerbating local problems rather than solving them.
And just because we're getting short on time, I'll combine a few of these. But to kind of take it to the personal, then to bring it to the kind of modern era of war. Someone asked, how did your perspective of America and war change following your deployment in Operation Desert Storm and Iraqi freedom? And I suppose related to that in terms of shifts in modern warfare, especially kind of, I think, an over-dependence upon an all-volunteer force. Would you discuss how weapons of war, like such as drones, are changing things? And then another person asks, is the use of drones in warfare more or less humane? And how would you describe that? And maybe just in a broader sense, a tiny fraction of the United States is active duty military at one time. It's usually less than 1%. If the American public is getting detached from the realities of warfare and drones, and overdependence upon special forces heightens that even more, where does that take us? And your own experiences, what did you feel?
Yeah. So my first deployment to Iraq was as a second lieutenant. I couldn't tell you anything about Iraq. I couldn't tell you anything about why we were there. I couldn't tell you anything about Saddam Hussein. Couldn't tell you much about anything. I just graduated from West Point. I was 22 years old. I didn't know anything. When I went back as a lieutenant colonel in my last assignment in Iraq was in 2009, I had a very different perspective. I had, by this point, had my PhD in history. I had studied before I went over. And I appreciated the complexities and the difficulties in a far different way, and understood the history in a far different way. What I saw personally in Iraq were some phenomenal Americans dealing with an incredibly difficult situation that suggested to me firsthand that there were limits to what we can achieve overseas. These were good people that I was serving under, smart officers. And, you know, I know that, you know, sometimes you'll watch Hollywood films and they're, yes, sir, no, sir. And they're all a bunch of kind of dullards. And I mean, you know, when you saw some of the senior officers that, not all of them, obviously, but when you saw some of the senior officers that were wrestling with the political and cultural and economic problems of dealing with this society in the throes of their own revolutionary war, of what was Iraq supposed to be like in the post-Saddam era. To me, it hit upon a point that I realized as a historian that I think suggested, not in a pejorative way, but that there are limits to American power. So as I tell my students when I teach the American war in Vietnam, that war, I think, when you boil it all down, the Vietnamese War was just that. It was a Vietnamese war. It was a civil war over what did it mean to be Vietnamese in the post-colonial modern era. That was a question that no American could answer. That was a question that no foreign force could answer. That question of what did it mean to be Vietnamese in the modern era, questions about identity, that was not for us to answer. Now, to get there, was it a deadly, horrifically violent way to answer the question, what does it mean to be Vietnamese in the modern era? Yes, it was. But we, in many instances, made it worse because we elevated the violence rather than diminished it. I saw the same thing in Iraq. We're good-meaning, well-meaning people. We're trying to help solve this problem. What should Iraq look like in the post-Saddam era? It was not a question we could answer. And so I think that is something, again, that is not politically appealing for us. We don't, as Americans, like to think about the proposition that there are limits to what we can achieve overseas. But as both a historian and a participant in some of our recent wars, I think it's important for us to wrestle with that proposition because it's important. And it helps us make better choices about when to intervene and when not to. As for the drones, it is an incredibly important question for us all to be asking in this moment. Because what it is doing, and I'm now here riffing off of late historian Marilyn Young, who was just a phenomenal woman, and her charge year after year as a historian was that we had to make war visible. That Americans were very, very good about making war invisible for the American public. And that was not healthy for a democracy. And what drones are doing right now is helping make war invisible for Americans. When we rely on special forces and we rely on drones to intervene overseas without any discussion among us, only recently have we seen, we were talking about it before, right? Only recently have we seen a little bit of discussion about intervention overseas with the attacks off the Venezuela coast. We haven't really had all that much discussion about us being militarily active on the global stage. And we certainly have been. Even after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have ended, we still have been quite active. We just don't see it. So I think it's incumbent upon us, and why I wanted to write a book like this was to inspire conversations about what war means for us. And we should all, in a democracy, be having conversation about when we send young men and women who represent us overseas to engage in combat, and whether it's right for them to do so, whether it actually protects us, and whether the objectives that we set out for them are actually achievable. So especially, I think, in an all-volunteer force where we oftentimes do see a gap between civilian and military worlds. The best way for us to close that gap is to have conversations about when it is proper for us to send military forces overseas, to help us better define what national security means in the post 9/11, post global war on terrorism environment. We haven't really discussed that all that much. We've been kind of, in an awful way, turned against ourselves in many ways, like we did during the Cold War era, instead of kind of recalibrating our conversations about how war is having an impact on our lives.
And I'll just combine these quickly, just it's for sake of time, and then the last two, just to kind of conclude everything. They're obviously not directly related yet. Obviously, some of these drug running boats were going from Venezuela. Some of these have also been going in the Eastern Pacific, right, as well. But in line of what has happened recently or come out recently, David asks, would you address Secretary Higgs defending the naval attack on the Venezuelan boat? And then I suppose Ken, I think, also asks, could you believe in or the degree of the narco threat? And then in a broader sense, we don't know what may or may not be coming, but Linda asks, do you think the current administration would actually consider, significant, invasion of Venezuela? Yeah. What is the threat? And then Jimmy, something you stress in the book, says, just bringing up Panama, do you think there are any relations to what happened with George Bush, 41, the father in Panama? I know it's hard to put all those together quickly, but could you address those?
Yeah. It's a lot.
All right. Just try to not keep people too long. Yeah. So
I need a little sniff of cocaine to get through all this. Just say no. So here's, I think, broadly what I'll say about this. And in part, I think it is informed by our relationship with war throughout the post-45 era. We should be, if we are an exceptional nation, then we should be exceptional for our values, not simply for the military force that we can send overseas. That our power, that our exceptionalism should come from our ideals, not from military force. And so the challenge, I think, not just for this current administration, but for any administration, is balancing those ideals with national security. Do drugs present a threat to this nation? I think so. So much so that we undermine our values? I don't think so. And the challenge now is for us to have more nuanced conversations, and I know that is incredibly difficult to ask in this moment in time. But we have to have nuanced conversations about where the legalities of war sit, where national security sits, where threats exist, where supply and demand, because there is a demand piece of this that we also have to have a hard conversation with, and why the relationships between war and society matter. There isn't just a supply issue with this threat of drugs. There's a demand issue. How much of that is cultural? How much of that is medical? How much of that is economic? Those are really hard questions for policymakers to be wrestling with. And unfortunately, I think in this moment in time, especially, we're just not poised to have honest, hard conversations with each other. And I really think we need to get better at that, because these are important questions, right? I don't think this is a throwaway question of, what do we do with a narco threat over Venezuela? It's really, really easy to be like, oh, this side believes that, we should just be pouring drugs into American cities. And then the other side says, well, you guys are just all a bunch of baby killers. And that's not helpful for us. And it doesn't solve any problems. There is a problem right now. There is a security threat right now. But we have to have more honest conversations about how best to deal with that threat in a mature way that balances security with our values. And I think that's why, to me, why these forums are so important. I was on the board of the San Diego World Affairs Council, and that's why I think these types of communities are so incredibly important, because you can help set an example. And I think you're seeing this room right here, right? That you have a generational audience having a conversation like this that hopefully inspires young folks to be like, we can actually do better. And I think that's where we have to be. And I don't know if that helps answer the question specifically. I'm not a policy advisor. I'm only a historian. But I do think part of the answer lies in us kind of depoliticizing the problem set.
And two questions not directly related to each other, but both very relevant to where we are today and hopefully where and how we move forward. I think good ways to end. And, again, I'll say to any of you, we have Greg's excellent book, selling it outside, and he'll sign it afterwards. I think everyone who reads it, even if you're a historian, even if you have deep military or certain experience, you'll learn a lot. But just kind of in terms of where we are, David asks, a pressing question. Are Americans presently more concerned with civil war or world war, in your opinion? And then in terms of, kind of overall frameworks and where we go from here as a country, Michael, another great student from Audio National School, asks, as the next generation, how can we frame our outlook to encourage diplomacy rather than just military intervention on a global stage?
Do it. Do it. All right, I've been fairly apolitical, nonpartisan for the evening. I'll do one sort of political answer. So it was David. Yeah. The Civil War versus World War. Yeah.
The technology is unbelievable. We have the A, the quantum computer in 1 minute, the whole 1 day for the best computer that we have.
Yeah.
The Chinese plan to establish 1 million people on Mars. The robotics and everything change. We are not in the evolution of the past.
Right.
Now it's a quantum jump. We have the fundamental things is you have to have a fantastic educational system to understand the complexity. Our destiny is high levels of complexity. All these things are history. It's like visiting the past.
Yep.
We have the future is unbelievable complex, and we have to be ready to handle it. 1 million people are going to be on Mars. And
maybe just let them answer.
Yeah, I got it.
Synthetic people in the war, we're going to have synthetic people.
Yeah. So I think the challenge for us right now is that there's been a lot of talk, obviously, at home about civil war. Folks, I think we need to put that to a stop, right? And I hate to be rude here. It's just damn lazy, right? Democracy is hard. It's so much easier to be like, I'm going to talk about civil war. It's hard to compromise. It's hard to come to an acceptance that compromise in a democracy is necessary and does not equate to weakness. And we're not there right now. It doesn't mean we have to compromise on ideals. But I think our tendency right now to take the worst extremes of McCarthyism, and I hate to quote her, but I will, to not follow in the footsteps of Laura Loomer, who says we need to make McCarthy great again. Folks, that is not a recipe for success. And so I think talk of civil war is about as unhelpful as it is just flat out lazy. What we do here in this American experiment is hard, and it always has been. And the moments I think where we faltered is when we start to turn in against ourselves. And there has to be a way to I think, move away from that. And sir, I think, you know, your point on education, I think is important here. That, to me, that is the way out of it. I'm biased, obviously. I'm a professor. I guess I'm also biased. So at some point I need to say bad things about UT Austin, so we can do that later. But I do think that education is important here. And I don't think it's cliche. I really, really don't. And I stress it to my students in particular because of the AI piece, because I've already started grading papers where students are relying on AI. And it's terrifying because all of this goes away when you ask ChatGPT to write an outline for you or to help write your paper. And I've already seen it this semester, and it's scary. Please don't do that. And so, you know, to me, I think education is hard work. Democracy is hard work. Talking about war is hard work, but it's also necessary if we're going to break this cycle of a militarized approach, not just to foreign policy, but I would also argue to domestic policy.
And then just for the, you know, Michael, the kind of students question, moving forward, obviously you are not saying, no one is saying we do absolutely need a strong, capable military. But how do we move upon maybe an over-reliance or first instinct to think of a military solution before considering diplomatic, economic, or other options? How do we kind of slow that train down?
So I'm part of a think tank, or on the board of advisors for a think tank in Washington, D.C. called the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. The Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And they exist by arguing that what we need in our foreign policy more than anything else is restraint. Restraint. And truth is part of that, I think. But making hard decisions about when to deploy a military force overseas, I think, is probably one of the most difficult choices that any administration faces. But I think there is power in restraint. I really do. And I think we have to get better at thinking along those lines. I think also what's necessary is a rebalancing of our budgetary prioritizations. We're nearing $1 trillion a year for our defense budget. I don't know how long that's sustainable. But if it is, the only thing that's going to come out of that is a militarized foreign policy that is not healthy for this democracy, and I would argue is not healthy for the security of the globe.
And I suppose to quote, not what you expect for, but General Mattis, if you're going to cut the State Department's budget, you better buy us a lot more ammo.
Right.
Yeah, something along those lines. Will you all please join me in thanking Dr. Gregory Daddis, and thank you very much for giving us a lot to think about. And we'll see you outside if you want to get your book signed. Thank you.